Hello Crypto Gang, welcome to another Lambo Life video. In this video, Bitcoin evangelist Andreas discusses the fraud and abuse committed by financial institutions. This may be controversial, but none of this is conspiracy. Stick to the end of the video for the best part.
What do you call it when a bunch of companies collude to set prices, fix markets, close off competition, capture regulators, and bribe politicians? we call it a cartel, right? Like the oil cartel. You've heard that term before, cartel? Who here has heard the term banking cartel? Oh, we don't hear that term. We don't talk about the banking cartel. We don't talk about the information cartel. Cartels are most insidious when we don't talk about them, when they hide in the shadows but in plain view. The banking system, payments, finance, are the biggest cartel in the world, and nobody calls them a cartel because they're the biggest cartel in the world. So they own all of the media, newspaper, channels, politicians, and laws. And that makes it very easy for them to get away with crimes. In fact, mega crimes. Just after the crisis in 2008, instead of some bankers going to jail, what happened was that they set up an additional layer of crime through a series of fraudulent foreclosures, robo-signing. Do you remember that crisis? And that's how cartels work, because first they capture the market, then they capture the regulator, who is always, of course, about consumer protection. And the regulator is there to protect against evil things happening, like, for example, money laundering, if you don't have a banking license. If you don't have a banking license, no money laundering for you. But if you do have a banking license, well, I mean, we have to protect the system. So there'll be a fine. Usually the fine will be less than what you made actually money laundering, and you'll get away with it, right? And of course, we don't want to see any financing of terrorists, except for the ones we do through the State Department, the CIA, or the banks, in which case those are good people. So we have the regulators, and they're captured. And what that kind of situation does is it encourages behaviors that are fundamentally parasitic. So when capitalism fails in this particular mode, when you end up with full-blown crony capitalism, so the thieves are in power, literally, that's kleptocracy. And what happens when you have a kleptocracy is that the most parasitic behaviors get rewarded. So it's actually not about competing. When you run business at that scale, it's not about competing. What it is about is finding the biggest pipe of money, the biggest flow of money in the economy, straddling that pipe, sticking a straw in it, and sucking as much of that money out as you can. So you can establish yourself as a parasitic leech on a flow of money, which pretty much describes the entire banking, financial, and payment system. The idea is you find a job that requires an intermediary, and the reason it requires an intermediary is because you've made sure that you've bought some lawyers and some Congress people to write a law that makes it require an intermediary, specifically you. And then you stick a straw into that flow of money and you start extracting rents. It's called rent-seeking behavior. So you take, half a percentage point here, half a percentage point there. We have this wonderful thing called fractional reserve banking, which if you tried to describe to a 5-year-old, they'd probably turn around and say, hang on, that sounds like a fraud. And they would be right. But of course, there's a big difference between a fraud and something that's legal. And that depends on which politicians you can buy to make sure you make it legal. So we have these parasitic companies, and they sit on top of these flows of money, and they extract rent. They create this rent-seeking behavior. And in doing so, what they do is they disrupt competition. They make sure that no one can compete. And they disrupt competition by buying competitors, by suing competitors, or even better, by making sure that competitors can't keep up with regulation by capturing regulators and making sure that the competition is kept at bay. And doing that, they built a cartel. Then they make sure nobody calls it a cartel. Instead, we call it the shining example of American capitalism. And the end result of this would be appalling in its own self, right? I mean, obviously, this is not a good model to run an economy. It's not a competitive model to run an economy. They robbed us blind. They stripped mine the entire economy. They had an orgy of fraud in which they knew exactly what they were doing, and all of that was ignored because we had to save the system, otherwise the system would crush us all. So we dumped more than $10 trillion in an orgy of quantitative easing into the banks, which they did not use to stimulate any part of the economy, but instead to blow another giant bubble into real estate, a giant bubble into the stock market, a giant bubble into bonds, into student loans, into subprime auto, into every part of the economy, while at the same time they made sure that those cops out there beat the shit out of anyone who had the audacity to go out and protest as part of Occupy Wall Street. And that didn't work. And they turned protest into a crime, and in that orgy of crime, they didn't just damage the economy, they raped the rule of law in this country and destroyed the justice system so they could get away with it. And we come full circle today, 10 years later, and where are we? $10 trillion in debt, 10 more giant bubbles, and it's gonna happen again. Because a system like that is fragile, because a system like that is corrupt. And it's not just corrupt, but it's architected in such a way as to reward and encourage that kind of behavior. In a system of incentives, if when you commit a crime, the penalty is less than the profits you made committing the crime, that is legal immunity. That is a very, very loud signal in a system of capitalism that says, do it again, only this time, leverage more. Now, a lot of solutions have been proposed to this. How do we fix this problem? The first thing we need to do is identify why this keeps happening. And in my opinion, looking at this from a technology perspective, I think it's a problem of architecture. And the architecture that's the core of this problem is an architecture of hierarchy and centralization. Centralization is responsible for this. Parasitic behavior gets rewarded because there are giant centralized flows of money that someone can go and tap in. Because we've taken the traditional model of commerce where you visit your local butcher and you interact with them and you get something and you give something and you trade with other people around you in your community, a system of peer-to-peer commerce, if you like, and we've converted it into a system that I call a peer-to-corporation-to-corporation-to-corporation-to-corporation-to-peer system, whereby when I pay my butcher, Visa, Chase, and 3 other banks get involved, because until 2008, there wasn't really an alternative. Holding dollars, for example, as a foreign currency, or hoarding gold, or putting it under your mattress, that's very easy for a government to stop, to break down, to censor. And they can do that by confiscating your gold and raiding your house. And if you are seen exchanging hard currency, like foreign currency, with others, you'll get shot. You won't just have a misdemeanor fine. And so these countries can take entire populations with them hostage on these hyperinflation orgies, but then something happened in 2008. And that something is Bitcoin. And what happened was, for the first time ever, we had an option. And that option isn't just a separate currency, isn't just a currency that can't be confiscated, that can easily be transmitted across border, a lifeboat currency that can be used so that people sometimes don't even need to exit the country. They can simply exit the economy virtually by trading in another currency right where they are and creating a parallel microeconomy, a little lifeboat in their community which becomes connected to other little lifeboats that can have life continue past the crisis. They don't all have to go down with the sinking boat of state to be patriotic. And that's what's happening today in Venezuela, in Argentina, in Turkey, and before that, in Cyprus and other places. It's happening again and again as people discover they have some other options. And of course, today, not many people can do that, and it requires a level of literacy and numeracy and technological confidence that's not available to the masses. But think about what happens in 20 years when some dictator decides to take an entire economy hostage and 25% of the population goes, see ya. I'm taking my money out. Now.
Whee! Look at us go! Hey Bitcoin, let's celebrate! We won!
I hardly call this a victory. Majority of the world is wrecked.
That's what they get for not believing in us from the start. They abandoned us because our market price was low last year.
Yeah, you're right.
Say, where's Litecoin? I thought he was with you a while ago.
He'll catch up eventually. He's my little brother. He always does.